Good afternoon on what is the last day of Roger Federer's career. Um, is it the last day, Jack? I mean, do you look at the Hurkacz match? Do you look at the maybe the 2019 Wimbledon final, or even before that as his last match? How do you see it, and how do you see the Laver Cup in general before we get into the Nadal rivalry?
Marking the 2019 Wimbledon final as his last day would be is deep and hurtful, I think, for anybody listening. So no, not that day. That wasn't the last day of his career. The last day of his career, yeah, was the Hurkacz match for me. This is basically an exhibition match, isn't it? I think Tiafoe and Jack Sock are going to do a pretty difficult job of making it look like it's a competitive match, but I'm sure they'll be able to play their part well. It's a bit of fun. It's got to be, surely, and Federer will keep playing exhibition matches, won't he? So it's kind of the last day, but it's not really
Yeah.
for me. It really did end last year.
Yeah, it's maybe the beginning of the exhibition tour, perhaps. At least that's how you could frame it. But listen, it's going to be fun, and I'm going to cover it myself later because of that obvious reason. Listen, first of all, I'm going to put forward why I've chosen this topic, this episode, and more specifically this rivalry, rather than many others. But in particular, of course, the other obvious possibility could be Djokovic, or even the three of them, if you like. The reason I've gone for Rafa, and the reason why I think it's the more significant rivalry of the two, with Djokovic, I don't know if it was much of a rivalry. I mean, there aren't so many epic matches. Perhaps that 2019 final and a couple of US Open semifinals for obvious reasons, because between those three matches I've just picked out, there were 6 match points. But they all went the way of Djokovic, those 3 matches. There's many others that were not competitive, and that's larger because of how good they both were in those particular moments. And I just think that the number of epic finals that these two guys had, as in Rafa and Roger, and 5 sets, etc., 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 and I also think the narrative. And we're not talking about even best here, I know, and that's what it's about. We're talking about the narrative. I think the narrative with the Roger one, with Roger being probably slightly ahead, certainly on the hard court, and even more so on grass for the first few years, but Rafa gradually reeling and reeling and reeling him in, and then Rafa pulling away before a dramatic turnaround, I would suggest, in their rivalry in 2017.
Yeah, I totally agree with the fact the narrative's more interesting for Nadal. Let's be clear though. At the same time, of course, Djokovic and Federer still a great rivalry in a lot of ways. It's more bookended though with Djokovic wins, I guess, and it's more clear cut. Federer was winning at the start, and then Djokovic was winning, and that's kind of the end of it, isn't it? I think also a lot of that rivalry comes down to, and it's harsh for Federer fans to hear, but of course, a lot of those wins that Djokovic managed to notch over Federer are, I guess, sort of typical of Djokovic's mentality, I guess, mental toughness. I don't want to say it's like Federer's mentally weak, of course not, but certainly that's why Djokovic won US Open 2010, US Open 2011, Wimbledon 2019, saving match points. A lot of these matches are kind of that's how they're characterized, I guess. And with Nadal, it's a lot more tactical, isn't it? And it's a lot more what's actually happening on the court rather than in their heads, I suppose. So it's more interesting to analyze from that point of view for me.
Yeah, me too. So let's start kind of with a broad look and have a quick look at the 16-24 result, if you like, of their rivalry of 40 matches. I mean, it still suggests that Rafa was on top, but what I would probably say is that if you took clay out, you'd probably have overall Federer would be probably marginally in front. Although I know Federer had some good results against him on clay, but away from Roland Garros, and we will address that in this show. But what I'd like to do, actually, even before I get into some of the matches that they had and how they tactically evolved, if you like, I would like to just have a quick look at some of these stats regarding the rivalry, which I think is quite interesting. Of course, they played each other 40 times. I touched on that before. But stat number 1 I've got here. This is an interesting one. The first Federer match was in doubles. First Federer and Nadal match was in doubles. They were against each other.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and of course their last match will be, or Federer's last match at least, will be alongside Nadal in
Oh,
doubles.
that's
So there you go.
fitting, isn't it? That's lovely.
There
Yeah,
you go.
that's really nice.
Yeah. Federer and Nadal never played each other at the US Open. I think that's something we've spoken about many times. I know it came close a few times, obviously, with those match points and stuff. To me, whether you're a Federer or Nadal fan, if you're a New Yorker, I get the sadness about that. But if you're not, for me, it's no big deal. I love this, by the way. Only once did either of them save a match point. And he says this is the article here. One of the most mythical Nadal Federer matches was the 2006 Rome final. 5 sets, more than 5 hours of play, a win in a 5th set tiebreak for the Spaniard, who had then only won one French Open. And also, Federer had 2 match points that day, albeit on the Nadal serve.
Yeah, great. I'd love to dissect that a little bit more. Maybe, I mean, I can talk about it a bit now, but it's certainly.
Sure.
I think it's probably the best match Federer played against Nadal and clay. Now I know he's got 2 wins against him, Madrid and Hamburg, I believe. But that match was such high quality, and he deserved to win it. To be honest, like he had it on his racket for sure, and he made it look like Nadal was a second-rate clay court player that day, and he was very unlucky to lose it.
Cool. In Grand Slam finals, Federer's only ever won once outside of Wimbledon. I won't go too much into this because, of course, we're going to come to it in a minute. But, of course, we all know which final that was and how it went. Nadal was the first player to beat Federer in a Grand Slam final. That's kind of interesting, but maybe not that surprising, I would suggest. Federer and Nadal have only played once in a final, at least, at the ATP World Tour Finals. Did you know that?
That's not surprising. That's on Nadal rather than Federer, right?
Yeah, because he hasn't done that well at that particular tournament. Indoors, hard court, I think that combination, perhaps even the time of year as well.
Yeah.
Federer's won more than once on clay. As I said earlier on, it's quite an important point to make. And you mentioned it as well when you highlight that 5 sets match they had in Rome. So contrary to popular belief, Federer did not beat Nadal just once on clay, but twice. In the final in Hamburg in 2007, that would have probably preceded the French Open final, would it? I mean, I know now it comes after. Hamburg in the calendar comes after, but I'm thinking back then it might have come before. I'm not sure.
It was because it was a Masters, right? So it would have come during the clay swing. I'm pretty sure.
Exactly. So, yeah. I'm not sure. Right. I'm not sure if it was at the expense of which tournament. Maybe Madrid, maybe Monte Carlo. Yeah, because Madrid used to be a hard court, right?
Yes. Yeah, it did.
I wonder if they changed because of a certain individual. Anyway, he also won in Madrid in 2009. Of course, that was the year he went on to win his only French Open. He being Federer, that is.
It's also interesting. I was going to say that's why I was saying the Rome Masters final is probably more impressive because the Madrid match obviously proceeded the Djokovic-Nadal epic in the semi-finals, right? So that did play a bit of a part in Nadal's level in that match.
Yes, I think some people have suggested Nadal's. I don't know if he's expanded too much on it, but the semi-final he had against Djokovic was both epic in terms of effort and strain, but also on Nadal's body to the extent that there may have been some hangover, not just in that final against Federer, but also even into the French Open. Of course, that Nadal kind of went out shockingly in the 4th round at. So to Robin Soderling. This one, though, I love. Federer has always had break points in every single match that they played except one, and it was the first match that they played.
It's wild. Yeah,
that's cool, isn't it?
That is cool. Yeah.
I'm going to come back to this first match in a second because I was actually watching some of the highlights earlier. But one Federal match, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's not even a word. Lasted less than an hour. It was the Masters 1000 semi-final in Shanghai in 2007. And it was 6-4, 6-1 to Federer. And it was in 59 minutes, the shortest ever match that they had. Were you aware of that match or even just the fact that it was the shortest they ever had?
No, not at all, actually. No.
Me neither. Okay, back to this match. Starting at the beginning, as I say, they went on to play each other 40 times. Nadal led 1-0 at one point because he won their first ever meeting and it was away from clay. It was on the hard courts of Miami in the 3rd round. Some points that I made regarding this match. Well, actually, I tell you what, let's go to the words of Roger Federer. this is in the immediate aftermath of this straight sets defeat that he had after their first encounter. So, of course, he barely knows Rafa. It's certainly in terms of the way he plays, or, I mean, Rafa had been on the tour for a couple of years by then, but this is the first time they've met. So Roger said he doesn't hit the ball flat and hard. It's more with a lot of spin, which makes the ball bounce high. Well, we all know that very much now. And that's a struggle that I had today. It's a struggle that he would go on to have for the next 13 years, I would argue. I tried to get out of it, but I kind of couldn't. Of course, they went on to meet in the Australian Open 13 years later, and we'll come to that, of course, in due course. Anything to say on those particular comments from Roger?
It's lovely sort of reading that from the perspective of a very young Federer, isn't it? And looking at Nadal like he's a stranger, sort of, and just getting used to his game. Really interesting, because it sounds like he started to work out the match a little bit as that match went on. I think he might have touched on that in the next match they played, right? Because did they play in Miami again?
They did maybe a year later, yeah.
Yeah, and same sort of thing. He kind of realised there was balls he could step in on, because Nadal doesn't always hit with a lot of depth, right? And that is part of the reason that Federer is maybe able to attack Nadal's forehand where he can't on clay, because it's much more difficult to step in on a ball that's going to unpredictably bounce off a volatile surface than it is on a hard court.
Some of the things that I noticed when I watched the highlights was the commentator's surprise when Rafa broke in the first set. It was just obvious from the commentator's tone that he expected it to be a Federer win. And of course you would do, because Federer by now had already been established. Nadal had yet to establish himself. Federer was already world number one. I think he'd won 2 majors by this point. He certainly won Wimbledon 03, and obviously January 04, he won his first Australian Open title. So he was very much established, and at the beginning of a 5-year reign, as it would turn out, 4 or 5-year reign at the top of the rankings, of course. The next match, as you mentioned, was in Miami. Rafa wins his first match. That was a 5-set match in the semi-finals, I guess it would have been in Miami, because Rafa's never won that tournament. He would actually go on to win, I think, the next 5 in a row, I believe. Let me just have a quick check with that. I think he won 5 in a row.
That's right. After he lost that match, right?
After he lost that match. Federer went on to win 5 in a row. And of course, Federer, I'm getting my Federers and Rafas muddled up. I'm getting Del Far. So it was 5 wins. It was a win for Roger in Miami.
Yeah.
And then, because that was in the final, and then it was 5 wins in a row, I think, for Rafa. Yes, it was. Yeah. Which, of course, included their first Roland Garros meeting in 2006. It was 2005, sorry, their first Roland Garros. I actually highlighted this as being the closest I felt Rafa ever got to him on clay. I think we mentioned it during the show we had on the French Open the other day. And the reason I highlight it in particular is just how tight the third set was. I know they had many 4-set matches, but they never had a 5-setter at Roland Garros. And the other thing was Rafa's reputation wasn't there at this point. So it was kind of 50-50 going into the match. So it was still 50-50. It was super tight at the end of the third set. When it was tight at the end of the third set in a couple of other matches, you just felt Rafa's going to pull away. And I do think that brings me sort of to the first broad point regarding the rivalry, and that's confidence. Would it be fair to say, Jack, that confidence was an issue for both players when they came up against each other in the early years of the rivalry?
Honestly, I think Rafa knew he had Federer's number in a way. I don't think we ever saw Nadal come on court not looking to play the same sort of, he never doubted what he was going to do, whereas Federer maybe had to take on a little bit more risk. He had to step in on a few more balls than he would like to against, a bit more aggressive than he would be against a normal player, a bit more unreliably aggressive is what I would say. So Federer was probably the one with a bit of doubt in his head. I don't think Rafa was so much. Yeah, definitely.
But that's what I mean by confidence. I mean confidence being the issue, as in like a slight lack of it when it comes to Roger, and obviously,
the opposite for Rafa. Yeah,
when it came to Rafa, and I do think he put doubt in Roger's head. The first person to do it, I would argue, and with the exception of Djokovic, maybe the only people to do it, because Roger just exhumed confidence, and suddenly now he was being beaten. I think what really, though, would have shaken his confidence more than anything else is is not so much on clay. Well, actually, yes, on clay, that final in 2008 at Roland Garros when it was straight sets, but even worse, just 4 games. I think that knocked Federer for 6. He'd never been, and maybe never, even Djokovic maybe never really humiliated Federer in the way that Rafa did that day.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, that was probably the biggest drubbing of. It literally was the biggest drubbing of Federer's career, right? It was completely one-sided and in a final as well. Oh my god, loads to say in this, of course, because like French Open, Nadal had definitely got Federer's number, but I think what also gets lost in the woodwork a little bit is how dominant he was at Monte Carlo as well. Because obviously Nadal's dominance at Monte Carlo could be more impressive than the French Open in a way, because over 5 sets you'd expect Nadal to somehow come through regardless of what happens. Over 3 sets, you've not got that same cushion, but somehow, I mean, Nadal won 8 years in a row. And Federer was quite often the guy who was getting beaten there as well. And I think Nadal's probably, like, if they played at Monte Carlo, if they played over 5 sets and it was 7 matches, he'd probably have the same record, if not even better than the French Open, because it's a little bit slower. The conditions are a little bit windier, all stuff that plays into Nadal's game, basically. He could be more comfortable there than the French.
What is it then about this rivalry and this matchup in particular that that Roger found so difficult against Rafa on clay? We'll talk about the other surfaces shortly, but on clay and during this period, why was it that Rafa was, aside from the confidence that we mentioned, why was it that Rafa was able to have his number, shall we say?
Yeah, hopefully I'm not spelling too much out. You might, if listeners at home might learn a little bit from this, but the obvious thing, obviously, as a lefty, is he was able to get to Roger's backhand so much more easily than other players. Not just as a lefty, but as a lefty who had a particularly large amount of topspin. So he didn't have to take any risk on that lefty forehand to get it to Federer's backhand, I should say, and be aggressive, because all you have to do, especially on a clay court where the ball's going to bounce even higher, is get it into that corner, get the short response from Federer, because he can't take on an aggressive shot. And if Nadal gets a sniff of an inside-out forehand, that's the point over, basically. So it was so difficult for Federer to go down the line without being really dangerous. It was really difficult for him to break that backhand jail, basically. And Nadal was the only player really that was able to do that consistently against Federer at that time.
Could pin him down right in that corner of the court, right? What we, of course, saw was on clay, or certainly in Paris, was Rafa pulling away with each meeting, certainly between 05 and 08. So I mentioned how close I thought that 05 match was, and arguably 06 and 07. But as I said, I felt by then Rafa was beginning to build his aura. But of course, by 08, the gap between them was never big, had never been bigger. In that final at Roland Garros. What was going on elsewhere? Well, they had a few hard court meetings, but they'd yet to meet at a major on the hard courts, which we'll come to in a second. We won't dissect all of the 40 matches, or Jack and I would be here until midnight, I think, and we'd actually miss some of the action at the Lever Cup. So we won't do that. We'll focus mostly on the majors. We've already touched, of course, on Miami and Monte Carlo and a few other meetings, and I'm sure we'll come across one or two others as well. But I want to get now to some of the other surfaces, because we've obviously talked about Rafa pulling away on clay, but on grass, he was eating into the advantage that Roger clearly had in 06 at the Wimbledon final, but by 07 and then, of course, 08, he had, overtaken him almost on grass, or certainly on a par, let's say. What do you make of that grass court matchup?
It's interesting because Nadal did have to learn to play on grass, and really the main thing was getting used to playing first strike tennis. It wasn't necessarily hitting aces. It wasn't hitting unreturnable serves. It was hitting good enough serves that you could then capitalize and hit a +1 that was strong enough basically to win the point outright. And it took him a few years, of course, but by 2008, that's when we saw both players, playing great serve, or good enough basically to earn a short response, and then quick sort of point over sort of tennis basically. And that was so imperative to Nadal's win in 2008 in particular, his ability to play short points.
Yeah, and I think Rafa served very, very, very well that day in 2008. It's amongst all the narratives from that particular final, it's probably one that gets forgotten. What I also noticed regarding Roger was, and I think I mentioned the other day, his screams of frustration in Paris seem to be a bit louder than anywhere else. And I know this is just probably me watching it again, but of course they're more frequent, of course, because he lost more matches there than he did, say, at Wimbledon or on the hard court majors. But then also that day of the final in 2008, again, I think Rogers showed a bit more frustration than we were used to. And it was also a sign, perhaps, to his opposition down the other end of the court. One thing I will just mention about this final, because there's been so many things said about it, but Roger did touch upon it this week, actually, saying it was the most painful defeat of his career. Now, he's put on the spot, and that's his immediate response. I'm not sure if I believe him, though.
Was that at the time? Sorry, is this post?
No, this is this week. He said, I see what you mean. So how did it feel at the time? Yeah, perhaps that is true. Perhaps in the immediate, when he comes off court or when the match point happens, perhaps the feeling of disappointment, because he'd already won 20 majors by the time he lost in 2019. But I think as a broader point, I put it like this: for his fans, I have not met a fan yet, and I haven't probably asked more than 10 this question, but which is the most painful? They always say the 2019 final against Djokovic, mainly because the 2008 final was extremely painful in some respects, but didn't have match points. Wasn't against someone that was, and it wasn't so close to the end of his career. And of course, there were so many happy memories still to come in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I agree with you there. So I was going to add one other note about the grass court matchup just before I forget, because it is quite important to note one of the biggest things that Federer is able to do on a grass court that he can't on clay court, of course, is his slice can bail him out of that sort of matchup backhand to Nadal's forehand. Federer's slice is probably one of the best in the game, if not the best in the game. And on a clay court, if you slice, you give Nadal time to run around it, and Nadal loves running around a slice. I mean, that's his go-to. So on grass, it's just not, it skids through the court. It's quick. It's not as easy to do that at all. And it was such a big factor in Federer being able to find ways out of that dynamic.
Another thing as well regarding running around, if you like, and this is my viewpoint is, of course, on clay, it's a lot easier to run around any serve, of course, on the clay surface. You'll see Rafa probably run around, I don't know, 30-40% of serves that are sort of heading towards his backhand, especially second serves. Whereas on grass, it's a lot more difficult. On a hard court, it can happen. And I watched that, let's say, the highlights today. There's Ghost backing you up regarding Federer's slice. And by the way, I'm going to come to Federer's slice a little bit later in his career, because I've got a point to make that Lubicic made on the tennis podcast. But before I do that, Rafa can obviously run around it on clay, but he can't on grass so easily. In the early stages of his career, I would say that Rafa's backhand was a weakness. Now I think it's probably top 10 on the tour, which is good enough when your forehand is that good and everything else. So also regarding that match today, I saw him running around on a hard court Federer's second serve a few times, which he was, I think maybe Federer got better on his second serve.
I would say Federer's second serve was great even in the early days. I don't know
maybe
if
it was
that's
that
so much
particular
the
day.
case.
It might just been that day.
Could be. And also, I mean, Nadal's movement. Nadal's movement has always been great, to be honest. It's only been in very recent years it's a little different. But no, it must have been that day, I would say so.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, Nadal put some as a result of that, Nadal that day, some lovely return winners off the second serve of Roger. So perhaps it was just that day. But anyway, moving on. They didn't meet, and this is a stat of mine, actually. They'd never met in a hard court major until 2009. Now, that's kind of surprising, bearing in mind that they'd been around by then for 7-8 years, if you like, on the tour. Obviously, Roger 1 or 2 years longer than Rafa, but they'd been at the top of the game for 4 years. I don't know how many years Rafa was number 2, but something like that. It's kind of surprising. It's surprising they hadn't met at a hard court major until 2009.
Right, that must be more down to Nadal, right? Because Federer was making slam finals left, right, and centre for that stage of his career. So yeah, we definitely down to Nadal rather than Federer.
Absolutely.
And obviously Nadal would have to make the final, right? Because as the number 2 seed, he's definitely going to be on the other side of the draw to Federer every time, right? So he must have just been losing before the final constantly.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was constant. I think it was his first hard court major final, I think 2009. So, but this, of course, didn't, in my opinion, reach the heights of 2008 Wimbledon final in terms of quality. Drama was there in many respects. Slightly different narrative, of course, with them exchanging sets until it went to the 5th set and Rafa pulled away. But what, again, coming down to confidence and emotion, what was particularly noteworthy was Roger, his tears afterwards. And these are tears in defeat. We're often seeing people with tears of victory, but we may see 1 or 2 tears tonight, no matter what way the match goes. But what was seemingly apparent was, and Roger's spoken about this since, he didn't like having a rival.
That's interesting, yeah. he would never, surely, he wouldn't have. Yeah, he would have said that at the time, but he wouldn't say that now, right?
No, not now. But
he
said what he said was, or I should probably add a bit more. He said he couldn't at first embrace the notion of a rival because for 5 years he was, untouchable.
Yeah, top of the peak, of course, with nobody there to contest it, right? That Australian Open final, and I know why it would have hurt him so much because, again, like the Rome Masters final, and this could be similar. This could take the top spot, maybe. That this could be possibly the best match that Federer's played against Nadal and gone on to lose because it was great. He was fantastic in that final.
Yeah, and I think perhaps they can both. We know that these 3 greats can all win when they're not playing well because they're that good and they're that mentally strong and blah blah blah. But I do think that Rafa probably has that skill, maybe even better than Roger. He didn't play at his best in that final. Roger was unbelievable. Rafa won. We'd see a similar pattern, I would argue, in the 2019 final between Federer and Djokovic as well. And the scoreboard, in a way, does reflect that, even though Novak won that final. But how comfortably Federer won the sets that he won and how tight it was when Novak won 3 tie breaks that day. Back to this 2009, though. But now, of course, what we've got with the narrative is it's really getting worse for Roger because, it was bad enough losing on clay. It was bad enough losing badly on clay. It was bad enough losing in his backyard at Wimbledon. And somewhere that he'd already won 4 or 5 times before, he's now losing to Rafa there as well. It's just getting worse everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's probably why it hurt him the most, right? Because he kind of realised he could have claim to nothing over the next few years if Rafa kept this up.
It would be a little while before they met again at a major, certainly given the previous couple of years, how they were frequently, in fact, the previous 3 years, they must have met about half a dozen times between the 3 of the 4 majors at least. And during this spell, Roger got his first win, I believe, on clay, that Madrid match in 2009 that we touched on earlier. And of course, even though they didn't meet, there was a revival, if you like, in the rivalry. They weren't meeting at majors, but Roger was now winning a few more again. He went back on the Wimbledon, gravy train, so to speak, in 2009. He picked up his first French Open, so he was the first among the 2 of them, and of course among the big 3, to complete the career slam. So there was a revival at least when they weren't playing each other, and it was actually Roger pulling away again from Rafa.
Yeah, totally. It's such an interesting dynamic, obviously, isn't it? But I mean, Rafa, that must have been the height of Rafa's career, though, right? At the same time, 2010 was probably his best year, arguably. Then going into 2011, obviously somebody else took over, but around that time, 2008 to 2010, at least Rafa was probably the best player in the world.
Yeah, of course, injuries would hamper him a bit in the summer of 2009, but yeah, absolutely. And of course, he won 2 Wimbledons out of 3. He may well have done more damage in 2009 at Wimbledon had he been able to play that particular tournament, but of course, he was injured. But at least Roger got the career slam under his belt and he could relax, perhaps. However, back to the rivalry at slams, it was going to get worse for Roger before it got better. Because, again, I talked about the gaps on grass and clay and how they evolved constantly in Rafa's favor. It was the same on the hard courts of Melbourne, because in 2012 they met and it was a tight first set, but then Rafa runs away with it in 4. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on Roger regarding the third set, but for me, the most brutal defeat that Roger would have, certainly against Rafa, but maybe against anyone on a hard court, would be the 2014 semi-final between the two. I know it was a tight first set, but it could well have been, could be. I'd have to think about all of his 100 or so matches, or possibly more, on hard court majors, but it could be Rafa's best performance on a hard court, that semi-final win that he had in 2014.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you take into account maybe Federer's a little bit lackluster after the 2013 season at all? I think he might have, had he changed rackets at that point, he would have been coming close to changing rackets anyway, so maybe doubts in his game, even if he hadn't changed it yet. Maybe there's other factors at play, is all I'm saying. But yeah, at the same time, that was a great win for Rafa, and it made you feel like, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but it made you feel like when you went into that 2017 Australian Open final, there was no way that Federer was winning, right? I think every analyst that, worth their salt at that time was just like, Rafa's got Federer's number.
Including me. Let's just have a quick look at a comment here from Ghost about 2008. I know we touched on it earlier. 2008 Wimbledon performance is the epitome of tennis heartache. You can play damn near perfect for 2 weeks and then get bested literally in the final minutes. Brutal. Yeah, Fred, good point. But yes, no, I'm glad you brought 2017 because I do want to get there, and we are edging in that direction. I know what you mean about this period, but I think it was quite brutal for him. Maybe not quite touching the Roland Garros final of 2008, but it would have been quite brutal to see his great rival just beating him all the time at majors. It was in the midst of a 6 in a row run or actually it was towards the end, as it turned out, of a 6 in a row run that Rafa had over Roger, over 5 sets at all 3 majors, on all 3 surfaces. A nice even spread, I think, between the two. I think it was probably 2 at each or something like that, or maybe even been 3 at Australia and 1 in Wimbledon, of course, and 2 in Roland Garros, but still a nice spread, if you like. It wasn't like they were all coming on clay as they had been previously. So, and I know you mentioned how he was in the mid, but he was in the doldrums, at least in terms of winning majors. He was in the midst of a 4.5-year run, Roger was, of not winning. Of course, during this period in 2016, Ljubicic comes on board for Roger. Give me your thoughts on, before we get to the 2017 final in particular, because I'll have some things to say about that before I ask you. Just talk to me about Ljubicic and perhaps his influence on Federer.
It's quite hard not to talk about 2017, to be honest. Talking about
Ljubicic,
it's true. Yeah, I mean, if I was going to dive right in there, honestly, like what did Ljubicic do between 2014 and 17? How much was he even involved at that point? I don't know.
I think he came on board in 2016. I think they met in 2015, and then he came on board in 2016.
Yeah, okay. So as I know it, basically, Federer went out of the game from about mid 2016, right? Came back in 2017. He says so much of his success was built up in that off season because he had his new racket for a couple of years, right? He was using that racket. It was 90 square inches to 97 square inches, so you've got a lot more surface area to work with. Basically means you can be more aggressive. You hit the sweet spot more often in the racket, so you can go for more aggressive shots more often. He said that Ljubicic, other coaches, etc., had been telling him for years, go more aggressive in the backhand. You are able to do it. And at the start of 2017, he says that's what made the biggest difference, particularly in this rivalry. Now, one thing I think people get wrong in thinking that Federer's been more aggressive with his backhand. And I think if you watch the Indian Wells final, the Indian Wells 4th round, I should say, whatever one it was, it's quite easy to think that Federer was just ripping backhands down the line, right and centre, basically, against Nadal. Now, he was hitting the backhand down the line more often, definitely. That's fair enough, or with more success, I should say, not more often. Because in 2000, if we compare the 2009 Australian Open final and the 2017 Australian Open final, Federer was actually hitting that backhand down the line more often in 2009. And but he was less successful with it than he was in 2017. And it's because of how aggressive he was able to be with the backhand cross-court. That shot that previously was always kind of defensive, or at least neutral, he was now able to sort of rip cross-court and occasionally get his forehand into play more often than he would have before. So it's more about backhand cross-court plus running around to get the forehand. almost like Nadal, I guess, does to Federer in a way. Obviously, you know, he's able to rip his forehand cross court and eventually get his forehand inside out. Federer just did it backhand cross court plus forehand, basically aggressive forehand. Because when you look at the 2017 Australian Open final and 2009 Australian Open final, the biggest difference for me is how many more forehands Federer was able to get to play in 2017, because it's far more than it was in 2009 when he was hitting more backhands than he was forehands. 2017, he was hitting more forehands than he was backhands.
Really cool, and I'm just going to supplement some of those points with some comments that Ljubicic gave to the tennis podcast this week. When he came on board in 2016, as you said, that training block that they had, he also highlighted it as being crucial. I think he did have an injury of some sort, which meant he couldn't really play until September.
Yeah, it was knee. It was still knee related at that point, right?
Yeah, but it was the different knee to the one that forced him to retire, right?
So it was, yeah. So it was.
Yeah. But still, nevertheless, it was a knee issue. But he was also fit enough to return for September. I would imagine if that there would have been a temptation, put it that way, and I think that's what Ljubicic was alluding to. There would have been a temptation, of course, to play the US Open because it would have come right at the end of August, bearing in mind that they were on the practice court by September. But Ljubicic felt, and I'm sure with Roger's agreement, although Roger's also highlighted that, and perhaps maybe Roger had one or two too many yes men for a while in that period, because I think he really extolled the virtues of Ljubicic and his coaching team towards the end of his career. I know he has the other guy, what's his name, Luti or whatever, who's been with him pretty much all the time.
Yeah, I can't remember his name. Sorry. Yeah, I know you mean
Luti or something like that.
Yeah.
And
Luthi, anyway, is it not Severin Luthi?
Yeah, Severin Luthi.
Yeah.
Who's also a Swiss. Oh, he's a Swiss guy. Ljubicic, I think, is Croatian. But
you got to remember. Yeah, you're quite right about yes men, because Federer missed his first slam at the French Open that year in whatever it was, like 17 years or something like that. Literally might be about 17 years, I think, because it wouldn't have been since the start of his career that he missed a slam. So I think in any instance, even though he'd already missed that French Open, in any instance, missing a slam was a huge deal for him. And I feel like you're quite right, especially a hardcourt slam, obviously. That must have been a massive, massive decision to make. And it probably was instigated by somebody else first and foremost.
Quite well. And that was my belief. I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was, especially what Ljubicic was saying, just how important that 6 months were, or that 5 months were to practice.
Yeah.
And so they actually did go into the 2017 tournament with a bit of quiet confidence, shall we say. I don't think that it was obvious to the rest of us because, of course, Federer was ranked 17, I think it was seeded 17 going into that tournament. Ljubicic also said that he asked him to play a bit closer to the baseline, so an aggressive sort of move as well.
Yeah.
Partly because, I guess, of his age, and also partly because of his age and his style as well. He also didn't want him to slice quite so much. So again, perhaps being a bit more aggressive on the backhand rather than playing cautiously, despite obviously having a really good slice. And also Ljubicic did say, it wasn't abandoned entirely. Of course not. And it would certainly be used depending on the matchup, but perhaps against Rafa, not use it quite so much. And of course, they turned that rivalry around with Rafa because prior to the 2017 final, I'd mentioned how there'd been 6 slam meetings that Rafa had won in a row. I think Rafa had won 5 out of the previous 6 meetings. We'll just have a quick look here. It was going in, of course, the most recent that Federer had won in Basel, but the previous 5 to that, Rafa had won at all tournaments.
Yeah.
So that was Australia and ATP, including an ATP finals there. So Rafa. And of course, it was 23-11, the overall head-to-head. And of course, 23-11 was turned around to 24-16 in total. So it's a huge change, not just a coincidence that I think Ljubicic comes on board. Of course, Federer is also responsible for that turnaround, of course. And in fact, Ljubicic even has some regret about the French Open semi-final as well. He highlighted in that interview with David Law, I mentioned that he just wished it wasn't quite so windy. And he said at least it would have been more competitive.
I keep forgetting that was a semi-final. I'm thinking that was like 4th round or something. But of course, Federer somehow managed to get to the semi-finals that year. It's interesting because, it was super windy. I actually don't think it's indicative of a proper clay court match between the two, but I would still argue, because so many of the improvements were on how early Federer could take the backhand on, I don't know if we would have seen the same success from him on a clay court. I think that might have been a little bit too much to ask on such a volatile surface, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think Ljubicic is not going as far as to say he thought that he would win, but at least it would have been more competitive.
Yeah, for
had
sure,
it been a
for sure.
normal weather day, if you like. I remember myself, I was there. It was very miserable that day in terms of weather. But also, we talked about tactics. We talked about tweaks to his game. But again, Ljubicic talks about the confidence, because having beaten him, he said it's all about Melbourne in terms of the confidence. Once he won that 2017 final, the confidence comes back and it's like, okay, I can beat this guy.
Yeah.
I do know how to do it. And of course, he won 5 out of the last 6 meetings they had.
Yeah, Indian Wells was a joke. I said that as an outlier, basically, because he really did just hit backhands down the line over and over again. It made Nadal look like he'd never played him before. Basically, it was wild. And okay, the Miami final was more like the Australian Open final for sure, even though it wasn't that close. I mean, it was like 3-4, right? But we've got it in front of us, of course. Yeah, there you go, 3-4. That was more how Federer was able to step in and take the backhand on cross court, give himself more chances to get that forehand into play. But yeah, the Indian Wells one, if you want to see Federer in full flow, I guess that's the one to watch.
And it's just a remarkable turnaround in what had seemed a fairly one-way rivalry from say 2008 to 2017, so the best part of a decade. Really, it was fairly one-way traffic. I know there would have been spots when Federer would have wins, including on clay, but really, it was like, as I said, 23-11. But a lot of those Federer wins, of course, came in the early days, if you like, that I highlighted. But yeah, and I think the way he turned around this rivalry. Listen, Roger's done so many unbelievable things, not least winning 20 slams and being world number 1 for a record number of weeks consecutively. But this is up there. This is up there. The way, the renaissance and the remodeling of his game and so many other things, and the recovery of this rivalry, if you like, and actually being on top. And had they played a couple more times, he may well have even narrowed that gap even further. I think it's up there with anything he achieved in the game.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'd agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've done a lot on Roger Federer this week. We've done a lot on his rivalry today with Rafa Nadal. They're going to be playing one more time this evening together. That's a lot to look forward to. Any final points just in general regarding the rivalry between these two players?
Yeah, I think we've talked all the tactics, right? We've talked everything that actually happened on the court, but in terms of something a bit bigger, it's such a poetic rivalry, isn't it? Just I think the way it kind of shifted and it turned, and obviously they're such good pals off the court and stuff. The bromance is somewhat real, even if they weren't invited to one another's weddings. There's still a little bit of heat between them. Anyway, though, yeah, it's great. They can bring it on the court. They can be pally off the court. It's fantastic. It's really nice. There's a reason it's so legendary.
I know. I think it does annoy some people, this friendship they have, but I think it wasn't always that way. I think that the first 3 or 4 years, I'm not saying that they were bitter rivals, but there was a few little things. Was it you? Somebody said to me the other day that he told the Wimbledon crowd to shut up in 2008, that final, when things weren't going his way. So there's a relationship between obviously Federer and the Wimbledon crowd, but it was never quite that bad between. I mean, you saw the final in 2008, the families are on top of each other.
Yeah, that's true. I know, yeah. Like, Nadal is obviously a fierce competitor, but that's all there would be to it, right? I mean, as soon as Federer actually talks to him off the court, I can imagine the respect would have been, from the get-go, it would have been huge.
Okay, one more question before we do go off air, and this is from Ghost. He agrees about the poetry of Federer. Why isn't Djokovic Federer or Djokovic Nadal produce the same kind of aesthetic? I'm guessing you mean, Ghost, I'm guessing you mean like in terms of the beauty of the matches. Is that what you think he means by aesthetic in this sense?
There's a ton there. Ghost is right. I think looking at Djokovic Federer, I'd just go back to what I said earlier. I think a lot of that match has been defined by Djokovic being able to sort of step up in the tight moments of the match. It's all about pressure. It's all about being able to sort of dig in. I think but at the same time, there's been a lot of beautiful matches. That's totally true. But I think that's what the lasting impression is for that rivalry. For Djokovic Nadal, it should be poetic. That rivalry is one of the grittiest, sort of the most intense rivalries of all time, in literal ways, in figurative ways, in terms of match time, in terms of how much energy they put into the match. It should be in a different way, but it's, obviously without the shot making of Federer, I guess, in that Djokovic Nadal rivalry, it's maybe not as easy for people to buy into.
I think the rivalries between, although this could be because I've got a soft spot for Rafa, but I do think the rivalry between Federer and Nadal and Federer Djokovic, both are just amazing for a million different reasons. I don't have the same feeling about Federer Djokovic, and I can say it about other rivalries. I can see when other matchups occur and they're amazing. It was just so much one-way traffic for 6 or 7 years, really, maybe even a bit longer, probably since Federer won at Roland Garros against Djokovic. That was a shocking win for him and an excellent win for him. But really, from that moment onwards, I don't remember. I don't think Roger won again at a slam.
I was going to say that's the last proper upset, right? The last ones I can remember was a 2015 win in Cincinnati where Federer had reigned supreme for years. Djokovic had never won a final there. And there was a round robin win in the World Tour finals, which just felt like pity money at that point because, I think Djokovic went on to beat Federer in the final anyway. So it was all a bit, he never really won a massive match, even if it wasn't a slam, right? He never won a massive match against Djokovic. Maybe the Cincinnati one's quite big, but it never felt like he really had his number at any point.
Exactly. Their rivalry was probably bottled up into 2 or 3 matches in the 2010-2011 period, the 2 US Open semi-finals and the final.
There was a Wimbledon semi, of course, as well. That was quite a big one for Roger, I suppose. That's probably the biggest win. I think the last big win for him.
Just a nice little one from Ed. 2006, Roger was 92-5, and 4 of those losses were to Rafa. Yeah. So actually, of course, he did have a lot of early success against Roger as well, and that helped him build up that 23-11 lead. Just anything else to add? I think we're pretty much done.
No, we talked that one through, I think, pretty well, John. It was great.
Thanks, Jack, for coming on board. Everybody else, especially Ed, I've not seen you before. I love that little stat you brought up there too. Tennis World. Look forward to tonight's encounter. Make of it what you will. And thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, guys.